Is it? Ahead of here. How are you, Brendan? Good to see you. Audio level, testing 1, 2, 3. David Crisafulli with Jarrod Bleijie and Fiona Simpson. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Queensland women deserve the right to have a baby where, when and how they choose. News coming out of Cairns of the risk to the future viability of the private sector in the capacity of the obstetrics unit there will send a shiver up the spine of young mums. And it is absolutely essential that the state government immediately looks to find a solution and works with the private sector to ensure this continues. Those of you who have seen the crisis in Gladstone unfold will know that the first domino that fell in that city was the closure of the private clinic. And we have now witnessed over 300 days of uncertainty because of that being the first domino to fall. We can't allow the same thing to happen in Cairns. The uncertainty that it breeds, the fact that young mums will be second-guessing their ability to have a baby in the city they call home is something that we have a laser-like focus in making sure that doesn't happen into the future. There has been nearly 40 maternity units closed in the last quarter of a century in this state, and only a handful have reopened. And we don't believe that in a modern Queensland that cities the size of Gladstone shouldn't be able to have a maternity unit. We don't believe in the city the size of Cairns that there's not the role for both the private and the public sector to play. My message to the government is simple, and that is this is a key service and one worth fighting for. We can't have an us and them mentality when it comes to the private sector. The private sector plays a role in meeting the demand. And when I hear comments to say that the public sector would be able to absorb that closure, that doesn't take into account how much pressure our frontline staff are under in the public sector. They are already at breaking point. And the last thing we need is for choice to be removed and more pressure to be put on to an already overflowing public sector. This is important, it matters, and the government must redouble its efforts to get to the table and ensure that the private clinic remains open and that the us and them mentality between the private and public sector ends in this state. Over to you, Jarrod.
Thank you, David. Good morning. Jarrod Bleijie, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Well, the PR spin from the Palaszczuk government knows no bounds, and we saw it today at the satellite hospitals in Ripley, where the new Health Minister talked about a $90 million budget blowout when asked the question. The reality is that is not true. The satellite hospitals have blown out to $110 million. Not even the new Health Minister is across her brief and knows that the satellite hospitals are actually blown out by $110 million, not the $90 million she quoted. Anastasia Palaszczuk promised these satellite hospitals would be up and running by now. 2 years, 2-year timeline she gave her own government. 2-year timeline she gave her own government to deliver these satellite hospitals. And they're not there yet. In fact, this morning they said it's practical completion. Well, Queenslanders know when you build a house, ask the builder if you can take over the house at practical completion. It's not the case. We've got hospitals without beds. We've got hospitals without doctors and nurses. There is no 24/7 available in these satellite hospitals. There is no overnight beds. And at the moment, we have a broken promise of a commitment for 2 years, satellite hospitals without doctors, without nurses, and without patients. That's the reality. There are no overnight beds and there is no emergencies. That's why we've been concerned that every time we hear the government talk about the rhetoric, that these are satellite hospitals. They're not hospitals as Queenslanders would expect. Only in Redlands last week, where the leader and I, with our candidate Rebecca Young, stood in front of the Redlands Satellite Hospital, it has on the sign, no emergency. They know it's going to be a huge issue for Queenslanders that think when you have something named a hospital, you'll go there for emergency. It is a broken commitment, it is delayed, it is blown out the budget, and the new Health Minister, Shannon Fentiman, by saying it's only a $90 million budget blowout, well, I'm reliably informed as well that the original details is now off the website. The details don't exist. Well, it doesn't surprise me, because Shannon Fentiman was the Minister for Child Safety that said she washes the data, i.e. they wash the data to make the minister look better. Well, is it the case since Shannon Fentiman has now been the health minister, that she has asked the department to wash all the negative data, wash the data of budget blowouts, wash the data for the original commitments to try and fool Queenslanders? They're not going to be fooled. Queenslanders will not be fooled by this, what the government are calling a reset or a reshuffle. As I have made the point on many occasions, this is nothing more than reheating a bad lunch. It's the same old clowns in the same old circus. And we're going to see it this week. The new health minister is going to get up, Shannon Fentiman, and try and convince everyone to forget the last 8 years of Yvette Darth as a health minister. Di Farmer, the new youth justice minister, will get up and try and make everyone forget that she was previously a youth justice minister, responsible for some of the weakening of the youth justice laws in the state. Other ministers will get up and try and wash out the last 8 years. Queenslanders will not forget. Queenslanders will not forget the health crisis, the housing crisis we have, and of course, the cost of living crisis. And at the head of all of that is Anastasia Palaszczuk. She is the premier of this bad government, overseeing bad policies and incompetent and bad ministers. All that this reset, as the government would have you believe, or as I say, reheating a bad lunch, has done is for Anastasia Palaszczuk's political survival. It's not about putting Queenslanders first. It's not about fixing the issues of the health crisis, the youth crime crisis, the cost of living crisis. This is about Anastasia's political survival. Fiona.
Thank you. I want to address the machinery of government changes. We've just seen yet another chop and change of key government departments. There's a youth crime crisis. There's a crisis with child safety, and the government's answer is a political fix, not about solutions, but once again ripping up these departments and shuffling them around. Some of these key departments have been shuffled around 6 or 7 times just in the last few years. Peter Coldrake spoke about the damage, the cost, the disruption from multiple changes in these government departments with a big impact in the regions. And this was a key recommendation of Peter Coldrake, not to have all this reshuffling of portfolios and swapping around key roles because it's costly and it's disruptive. Anastasia Palaszczuk as Premier was on the go slow in regard to implementing Coldrake's key recommendations, integrity recommendations, but now she's actually defying one of the key recommendations of Peter Coldrake about integrity issues in Queensland. Integrity matters because it's about ensuring people have access to the services they need when they need it with transparency. What we're seeing with this machinery of government, or throwing these poor departments into a blender, is actually disruptive, costly, and in defiance of a key recommendation of Peter Coldrake. Anastasia Palaszczuk has just ignored an integrity recommendation, and the actions that will come out of this is great disruption and cost, not solutions. It's a political fix, not a solution to some of these key issues.
Good question. I got the letter at the same time the government did, and I went up there to listen to the people at the front line. And I did so because the private sector plays a key part. And there are ways that we as a state government can work better with the private sector. And I just don't think it's acceptable to wave the white flag and say, oh, well, that's them and this is us. If we're going to heal the health crisis, everybody has to be rowing in the same direction. And to suggest that the state government doesn't have a role when it comes to regulation and the way that we use the staff in the public sector and the ability to work with the private sector, I just don't believe that's the case. And the warning bells were there with Gladstone, and we have seen where that has got to. We can't allow that to continue like dominoes in other parts of Queensland.
Specifically, what would the LNP government do? Do you offer them money, or what would the government specifically do to keep them up?
I think with the individual obstetrician, there's the ability to increase the ability for them to practice in the private and public sector. I think that's something that could be done. I think we have to, at the very least, be willing to sit down and listen to the concerns of the people at the front line, both in the private and public sector. I think that should be the going in position. But there are ways that you can make things more attractive, starting with improving the culture in Queensland Health and starting with valuing the people who are there, giving them the flexibility they need, the workplace they need. Let us attract the best, retain those who we have and value them, and let's work together to heal a crisis that we just cannot continue to see unfold.
What's your position on mobile phones in schools?
We've long believed that principals should be able to make those decisions. I will make this point that increasingly more and more principals are banning them under that regime, and I'm watching. I'll be watching with interest what happens across the border in New South Wales. But the LNP's long believed that the principal is the best person to make that decision in consultation with the local school community. But we are seeing an increasing amount of principals who are taking that step. No, we don't, Marlena, because we believe that the principal and the school community is best placed on assessing all of those needs on a school-by-school basis. But I will make the point that more principals are coming to that realisation. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, any medical facility is welcomed. Let's just call them what they are and be upfront with people. If you say something's a hospital, it has to have an emergency department and beds, and if you say it's going to open in 2 years' time, good governments follow through and make that happen. Neither have happened in this regard, and I think that's the issue. It's not a case on whether or not the facilities will be beneficial. Anything to help after 8 years of underinvestment will be welcomed by every Queenslander, but just be upfront with people. Well, of course, but I would hope the government comes to that realisation far before then. It's absurd when the government's department spoke so candidly about the dangers of calling it a hospital. So reflect on that, admit that you've got it wrong and make the change. No one benefits by calling something a hospital when there is an emergency department and there aren't beds. That's not good for anybody. Well, with the greatest of respect, I was there with the Deputy Leader in the Redlands the other day, and there's been expense put to explain to people that there's no emergency department. I would think that by calling a facility an appropriate name and outlining what it does as a clinic would be a far better result than trying to convince people that something is something that it is not. Well, when I hear the word hospital, if I was driving past and I saw the word hospital and I had a sick child in the car, I would think that would be the place where that child would be able to get emergency treatment and a bed. And that's what the government's department has said. So let's be upfront with people. Now, the government said they were going to deliver hospitals. Okay, if that commitment was not quite as upfront as what it should have been, let's right the wrong now and call these things for what they are. They're not hospitals, because if there aren't emergency departments and if there aren't beds, they aren't a hospital. So be upfront, explain what the services there are, let's value them, and let's be upfront with the Queenslanders who need a world-class health service.
And they've given assurances to their federal colleagues that if the LNP wins government, they'll either roll back the legislation or they'll ensure it doesn't go anywhere.
No.
Would it be rolled back if the LNP wins government?
Absolutely not. And you would have no doubt heard my speech as to why I think it's important, and I believe that. And I believe that this is an opportunity to outline a better way forward for Indigenous communities. And I won't take a backward step on how important that is. I've been to them all, and I've seen conditions there that I'm not comfortable with. And if as part of this process we can come up with KPIs around health, water, education and home ownership, and that's something I just do not believe we can't find a pathway forward to enable people in Indigenous communities to own their own home. That's the fundamental pillar of aspiration, to be able to own a home in a place that you live and you love. And if as part of this process we can set KPIs that hold governments into the future accountable, I would love to be the first government that is held accountable in delivering those things. But I haven't heard that. As I said, we supported this because it matters, and I'm determined to drive real reform.
And we've also heard from members of the state team that they've been getting quite a number of calls about the LNP's decision to support the legislation from party members. Have you had any concerns from
I'll listen to Queenslanders on any issue. I know why this is important, and I know why, if we structure this the right way, tangible good can come from it, and that's why we've backed it.
Are you concerned that you've got the grassroots members offside?
I will always do what is right, and we will always listen and reflect on the things that we can do in this place to make life better. And I haven't met a single Queenslander who doesn't want better for those 17 communities that I've been to. Not a single Queenslander, not a member of any political party, across the political divide. And if we get this process right, this can be a defining moment in driving good, and I'm passionate about that.
The opposition voted to support the legislation. Did members of your team speak up about their concerns about the legislation, or were you blindsided by the fact that they're saying something different about the legislation passed?
I'm blindsided by your comments. I haven't picked up what you're saying. I listened to people's contributions in what was an historic debate, and I thought the contributions across the political aisle were the right ones, and I would encourage you to read my contribution, and it underpins why I'm passionate about particularly Indigenous issues in these communities.
Were you aware that members of your team didn't necessarily believe that or support the legislation?
Only through you. I spoke. A number of our team spoke. We took a position which you see from the vote as to how important we saw it, and nothing will stop my view that if this is done in the right way, we can bring about generational change. And for the better part of the last quarter of a century, there's been one party that's run this state, and I don't believe there's been tangible outcomes for those Indigenous communities. Now, I don't believe that's through a lack of goodwill, or in many cases through a lack of money, but there's just been no one who's been prepared to set targets and do something. And as a result, you've got a couple of dozen people sleeping in one home. You've got kids who aren't going to school. You've got things that are happening to young kids that shouldn't in Queensland. And my intention is to set KPIs on all of them. And the difference between myself and the Premier is I will hold ministers accountable for that. There'll be no running around the table and having some sort of charade that things are changing when nothing does. There'll be people who'll be held accountable. And you can't unless you're willing to measure something. And that's what I see coming from this process. Real outcomes that every Queenslander can look at and say, that's the change that we wanted to see. That's real change. And I haven't met a single person, not in that building or members of the party, that don't believe in that. People want to see more. Say that again, sorry? No, not yet. Not yet, but I'll make my position known shortly. Well, I want to see I know the report has come back from the parliamentary committee, which I've got to spend some time having a look at, and there's still some negotiations going on at the moment that you'd be well aware of. So I will make my position clearly known, and I'll do it to all of you there.
The government holding a post-budget bunch asking us to pay for the councils cash for access.
Look, we'll always comply with the law, and people will always comply with the law, and I'm always going to be upfront with you. People can make their own mind up whether or not the Premier's comments today are hypocritical or not. That's a matter for her.
They've attacked the Parliament, though.
Yeah, I've seen that.
How do you feel seeing what they're doing now?
The Premier can justify her actions. I'll justify mine. I've been upfront from day one. Queenslanders can determine whether or not this is hypocrisy or not. I've seen the multitude of positions that the government's taken on this. All I'll say is my view is laws need to be set transparently and complied with, and when people make a commitment to do something and then crab walk away and then try to pretend no, it's not hypocritical, most Queenslanders will see through that. Thanks a lot, guys. See you later.
Cheers.
Ciao, ciao.